Welcome to Left of the Law. In today's episode, I'll be discussing the idea of universal basic services. Now, before I go into explaining what universal basic services are, it's important for me to lay down the foundations on which this idea was built. So recently, I was watching a TED Talk that was delivered by Aaron Bastani, who is the founder of Navarro Media. And in that, he described something called universal basic services. So that was the first time I'd heard universal basic services explained in the way it was. I'd heard of the term before, but it wasn't really something that really stuck to me. This TED Talk in particular was very, very pivotal in, furthering my understanding on different ways in which governments, states, and definitely policymakers can influence the trajectory of its citizens. And I think universal basic services is definitely one way that standards of living can drastically improve in the United Kingdom and definitely globally. But in this video, I've of course make it more tailored to the UK because I think it's a bit more suited, especially considering we have a free healthcare system. So universal basic services are a service provision which grants all citizens unconditionally with free basic goods and services. So if that definition didn't really make sense, universal basic services are goods and services which every single citizen is entitled to through the provision of the state, through general taxation, or through general public spending by the government. Now, right after I heard the TED Talk, it really sprung to mind that, this is a very, very interesting idea. And I'm pretty sure that this has definitely been studied in depth by, perhaps an academic or an institution. And of course, I was correct in that sense. So I Googled universal basic services and I realized that I had actually seen the term before, and it was actually something that John McDonnell, who was the former shadow chancellor of the Exchequer for the Labour Party, something that he actually proposed to bring into power. It was part of a brief documentation that I found on the Labour Party website. But in more detail, I was looking for something in greater depth. So I found that the University College London, UCL, had actually created a 53, if I'm not mistaken, a 56 page document all about universal basic services. Now, a reason why this idea of universal basic services has come to light in recent years is because there are many issues that are currently at the forefront of people's minds. People at the bottom of the pay scale, people at the bottom of society are suffering dearly with paying rent, paying the price of food, paying the price of energy, paying the price of transport. And there isn't much room for these people to save, to innovate, and to live fulfilling lives. So this is why UCL have actually broken this down into much simpler details, and they've actually told us that this is the reason why we've proposed this, and this is the reason why we think this will be an effective policy introduced by any government, as long as it's backed and the funding is very much on point. So currently 4 million people struggle to put food on the table for themselves and their children. This is per annum, by the way. So 4 million people struggle to put food on the table. 71% of students are currently stressed and anxious about the basic cost of living. 17% of people earning less than £20,000 have never used the internet before, whilst 2% of people earning £40,000 and above never used the internet. 16,686 people died in deprived areas from avoidable deaths, whilst less than half of that figure, which is 7,247 people from less deprived areas, also died from avoidable causes. From 1980 to 2014, bus and coach fares have increased by 58%, and they've increased also by 63% in real terms, so that is adjusting for inflation. Between April 2012 to September 2014, 2,293 houses were built, whilst 22,899 were sold. Now, there are many issues within the UK, and some of these issues are more prominent and more striking than others, of course. So, just to touch on each briefly, if we were to take a look at, for instance, the housing one, this is, I think, one of the most, shocking ones out of the listed examples. The fact that there are more houses sold than being built. So if that is the case, then of course, as a result, we will see an increase in house prices. We will see house prices reaching crazy amounts of money. That isn't something we should be really surprised about. What we should be surprised about is how the government haven't been able to tackle this issue. Now, 16,000 people dying from avoidable deaths is very, very scary. It's very, very sad. Now, the fact that this is happening in deprived areas, whilst in contrast, you have a very, very significantly lower number in less deprived areas, also shows not only the discrepancy in areas within the UK and how much inequality there is, but it also shows how damaging it can be to press and to focus and to concentrate most wealth or most of the government's budget into more affluent areas. 42 million Americans are recipients of food stamps. The fact that 4 million people in one of the most prosperous nations in the world are unable to feed themselves and their families, and are thus unable to put food on the table for their families, essentially, is incredibly scary, and it does highlight the massive discrepancy between the rich and the poor in the UK. And of course, you can say this about other Western nations. University students are currently feeling the brunt. After they graduate, they're already going to experience massive amounts of debt on their names. So, what is the benefit of taking a degree out if you're not only going to accumulate so much debt, but during your degree, you're going to be worrying about how you can essentially live, how you can survive to supplement your academic studies. And lastly, 17% of those on less than £20,000 aren't able to simply access the World Wide Web. They aren't able to access the internet. What this does is not only does it deprive them from social benefits, it deprives them from interaction and meeting new people online and creating friendships, but it also deprives them of the potential ability of innovating, of creating new products, of finding new passions, of starting e-commerce businesses. And the statistics that I have just read out in this video thus far are an indication that something needs to change. The fabric of society needs to change. We really need to find a new way to create a system that benefits and helps and aids all. Now, it's completely understandable that when a new idea is being proposed by, perhaps the government, or, by a think tank or an academic or an economist or anyone, it's important to have the figures and statistics for costings and such, because people have their own preconceptions on the idea of the deficit and how much are you going to raise tax by. Is this going to be a social benefit for all? Now, my first response to that is yes, of course. My second response to the former question is, of course these things are costed, and I will break down the costing of my findings, or of UCL's findings rather. If Universal Basic Services, UBS, was to be introduced into the UK, as of right now, this would cost us 2.3% of GDP. So University College London's findings suggest that 1.5 billion social homes would be built if this proposal was to take place, and if it was to take place, through their aid and assistance. So 1.5 million homes will be built, all of which at the cost of £0 rent, meaning the residents or those who occupy these properties do not pay a single penny of rent. In addition to that, no council tax fee, and of course you have to worry about utilities and things like that. So the cost of utilities will be subsidized if necessary or if need be. That is something that UCL have stated clearly on their plan. So this, in the duration of 7 years, in the beginning would cost around £6.1 billion, and as it continues from here onwards, or post the 7-year duration, this will increase to £13 billion. Provision of food is quintessential in ensuring that not only our young people are fully equipped during their stages of education, but it also ensures that our adults, our backbones of the workforce, are fully equipped during the process of work. As is done with our current elderly, so those who are above the age of 60, providing freedom passes to all children, to all adults, would also mean that the ease of transport and the burden of transport would not be felt by parents or those specifically on lower incomes. This would remove the burden of parents worrying about how to afford to get to work, or perhaps how to get their children to school, and rather it will enable them to put their finances into perhaps savings or other areas of interest for their families. This would, as per UCL's documentation, cost around £5 billion. The provision of information falls under the topic of providing those with internet, providing people with the basic privilege of having a phone and also a BBC TV license. This would drive innovation, and it will allow and enable adults, or perhaps teenagers or young adults, to spark an interest in things of the internet, perhaps e-commerce businesses, or maybe creating applications or coding. This would be the most expensive proposal at £20 billion. Now, expanding healthcare. It's important for our healthcare, namely our NHS system, is up to speed. Perhaps reform is the way. Perhaps we should continue to pump more money into the NHS. But either way, it's important for the NHS to remain free under public ownership. With the growing prevalence of things such as mental health in our young people, it's integral that we have a strong, united health care system that is robust in its approach in tackling all aspects of health. A healthy workforce is a productive workforce. All of these things, if provided, would be a massive public good for the economy. In total, this would cost the government £42 billion. As I mentioned, 2.3% of GDP. As mentioned by Aaron Bastani in his TED Talk, this should be funded completely by a progressive tax system. In the UK, capital gains is taxed lower than income tax. So essentially, we tax work more than we tax wealth. Now, this is why I've also come up with the idea of perhaps a one-off wealth tax. This isn't a yearly tax on wealthy people. However, this is a tax that will accumulate quite a lot of money through the taxing of assets, the assets that have currently seen massive spirals in price. And as assets have gotten more expensive and an increase in price, this has actually widened inequality. So essentially, introducing a one-off wealth tax would tackle two things at once. Not only would it slightly reduce inequality, but it would also aid the provision of universal basic services. The possible cons of UBS would be proposed by free market capitalists, those who argue that individualism is the key to success, liberty is the key to success. However, you can't have liberty if basic standards of living aren't up to standards, aren't up to the level of the current circumstances that we find ourselves in. We are in the 21st century. People should have the ability to feed their families. People should have the ability to reside in a place with security. People should be able to travel to and from their workplaces, to and from school with ease, without having to worry about the costs of travel. People should also have the ability to have access to healthcare, to have access to the internet. These things will drive the trajectory of the workforce. These things will drive innovation, which in turn would fall in line with free market principles. More innovation, more economic efficiency, more profit. As you begin to get a more productive workforce, you do see two things happening in the economy. So you not only see economic growth increasing in the economy, but you also see a rise in general taxation. So what I mean by this is when more and more people are working in the economy, there's more people being taxed. More people being taxed leads to greater tax revenue. As always, all sources used in today's video will be left in the description down below. And of course, as always, please spark a debate in the comments section. This is greatly welcome. Now, the next video will definitely be on something to do with either the history of both the Conservative and Labour Party or the wealth tax. The wealth tax is the same wealth tax that I of course mentioned in today's video. Please be sure to leave a like and subscribe, and I'll see you guys in the next video.